The Stories Games Tell, and Reflection on the Aforementioned Lesson, by me, Jacob Shar. My students for this lesson were 4 ELL students. We're all pretty good with English. Their proficiency level is typically between 3 and 4. They can listen to instructions, they work diligently, they'll ask for clarification if they don't understand something. In a lot of ways, they're model students. Now, all 4 are Hispanic descent, and all 4 were placed in a pull-out transitional English as a second language program, which means they couldn't use their first language for writing or speaking. Everything they got had to be in English. Everything was English about this program. Now, my topic, video games, came about as a result of how my professor had a class split into groups to determine unit topics and lesson topics. In this case, the group that I was in came up with media as the unit topic, and then we came up with lesson topics. Video games coming up when one of my group members mentioned that the students we would be teaching were all really into video games. I had opted to be one of the last people to pick a lesson topic because I would also be one of the last people to actually teach a lesson to the students at the Gettysburg Middle School. So I figured, if I'm going to have the most time to craft a lesson, I should be the last one to pick a topic, to minimize difficulties for my fellows. That's how I ended up with video games. Once I had the topic, coming up with goals was rather simpler. I would just tie video games to storytelling and narrative elements that the students already learned in class. And that'd be done by having students identify elements of storytelling within games, such as narrative plot or characters, and to tie it in with the media unit, they just need to determine how video games differ from other forms of media. The approaches for such was popular culture immersion, because video games are a form of popular culture. There's no reason not to use that. And for when popular culture immersion doesn't give enough context, or the context is too narrow to understand a word, I'd fall back on direct instruction of vocabulary. Now, the first steps to this lesson was that I would provide a brief introduction to media to refamiliarize the students with what media is and the unit itself, and that secondly, throughout the lesson, students would learn some key vocabulary, such as media, which is what our unit was focusing on, entertainment, interactive, and immersion, which sets out how video games differ from other forms of media, cooperative and competitive, which are descriptors for the 2 broad categories of video games, and plot and characters, narrative elements that are found in video games that the students should be familiar with, but didn't think about when just playing their games. This was, again, all done via class discussion. I'd typically be asking questions, the students would be answering. The key vocabulary would be identified when it came up in this discussion, and I'd write out the meaning on the board in case the students wanted to write it down for their own notes, to keep things fresh in their head, to refer back to when they needed definitions, and to just understand the unit better. You'll see how this was done in the upcoming video clip.
If you watch a movie, do you have any sort of input into it? Can you change how a movie plays out or unfolds? No. When you watch the news, can you change against pressing a button, or are you just stuck with whatever they give you?
Whatever they give you.
Yeah. And what about when you play a video game?
You have to pick when you want to finish.
Yeah. A video game is interactive. Do any of you know what interactive means?
Kind of.
Kind of?
Yeah.
Alright, so something that is interactive simply means that it requires or needs somebody else's input. In the case of video games, that input is you, pressing buttons, making things happen. If you just sit there, typically the game won't progress or play itself. It might end, depending on how good it is. Yeah. And then interactive just requires your input, and probably the user. And in this case, you guys will be playing.
And here's proof that the students were paying attention to this lesson, and writing down notes and focusing on the vocab when it came up. One student allowed me to take a picture of their notes. While they don't have all the words, they do have a fair number of them. They wrote things down as I wrote them down. They were paying attention, and they're trying to commit stuff to paper. On to the middle segment. In the middle step of my lesson, I prompted students to talk about the games that they played and what the plot of them was. It turned out most of them played multiplayer games, and it's rather difficult to pull narrative parallels from a multiplayer game. They struggled to do that, so I came up with the narrative parallels myself, as you can see in this upcoming clip.
I also have any examples I want to throw out there. Fortnite. What's its story?
It's just like a unrated game.
So the multiplayer you're talking about then?
I don't know.
Or are you playing against other people or just a computer?
Against other people.
Okay, then yeah, that would be multiplayer, which stands for multiple players. Yeah, so Fortnite is just a straight up contest. It's a competition. The story there is a bunch of people trying to win something, and most of them lose and one person wins. Kind of like the Hunger Games, really, in that you start off with a whole mess of people in an ever-shrinking arena as they all try to off one another. It's an alright book series if you want.
Finally, for the last steps, I had the students each individually write out a basic plot line for their own video game. One of their own creation. And they really seemed to like it. They all grabbed paper. Well, I handed out paper. They were started to write things out pretty much immediately. The only thing that hampered them was time constraint. I had originally meant for there to be 20 minutes for this activity. They had 10 because I showed up 10 minutes late to my own lesson. So I had to adjust grades accordingly. The way I did the grading was via this rubric of my creation. There was a maximum of 6 points and 3 categories: story, characters, and grammar. For the story, students needed to create a detailed plot with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and have the broad outlines of a setting. For their characters, they would be described in physical and mental terms, and given some form of motivation for why they're doing things in the game. And grammar was simply the students largely adhering to grammatical rules and proper spellings of the English language. Given the time constraints, it was unfeasible to grade the students according to this metric. So what I ended up doing was, seeing as they had half the time, was that I would simply take the satisfactory requirements and count those as excellent, take the not satisfactory, count those as satisfactory, and make not satisfactory, or 0 points, simply not having things. Nothing at all. Now we can just look at the student's work itself. So, the first student decided to box off their plot and try and write their characters outside of it. And here we see a phenomenon that's repeated for 3 out of 4 students. They decided to draw some aspect of their game, which I wasn't expecting. I thought that they would just be writing a description of the characters and writing out a basic plot. I didn't expect them to want to put pictures to those characters. In this case, this is the villain of the game, an evil Poppy, who is apparently the bad guy, according to this plotline, where it's established that the game is an emoji world, where you're a human just trying to get away from a bunch of evil emoji, and you have to beat this Poppy. So there's a setting established, and a basic premise. They started to make a list of the kinds of emoji that one would run into. And given the time constraints, I'd probably give this a 4 out of 6, maybe even a 5 out of 6. I'd like some more detail about this Poppy or the human you're playing as, or what the end of the game would be like. But again, they were short on time. The second student didn't really start when the activity began, and they were having some trouble coming up with things. They ended up taking inspiration from their other classmate, and that again, it is emojis. In this case, pack emojis, which I imagine means that the game was to parallel Pac-Man. They again decided to draw some pictures of their characters, but they give no information on them. And they gave the beginning of a plot, which is they're animals that are trying to catch something, I believe. Ultimately, they were having some trouble coming up with stuff. They decided to take inspiration from the person sitting next to them and their own experiences. But there's very little here. I would give this 2 out of 6 because it's simply missing so much. And none of the other students were missing nearly as much. They definitely would benefit from more time as they started to come up with an idea, but just weren't able to develop it. This student decided to use a picture to draw the setting rather than any characters. They wanted to title it something to do with Paris, but couldn't come up with the French, so they just opted for Paris as the name of the game. And they set up that there's a girl going to Paris, and that she's going to set up a business to make various desserts, which is pretty neat. The only thing is that we have no description of the girl as a character. They're just sort of there. But it sets out a basic premise, a setting, a sort of plot. I give this a 4 out of 6 given the time constraints. Finally, the last student opted to just write out a paragraph. They got a list of characters, they've got a plot line, they've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. Their spelling and grammar isn't the best, but it doesn't impede reading. They establish why the knight wants to save the princess. It's because they're captured by a dragon, and they gotta go save them. A standard plot, but a perfectly servable one. I'd give this a 4 or 5 out of 6. Now, for aiding those of lower proficiency in the class, I'd come up with an MPI that was fill in the blank. It turned out to be unnecessary because my students knew most of the vocabulary or understood it rather quickly. I just used it as a reference sheet for when writing out the definitions on the board. For the 4 principles of language acquisition, I feel that my lesson met all of them. The key vocabulary was rendered comprehensible by us identifying it, talking about it, and writing out the meaning on the board. For contextualized instructions, it turns out video games were very handy for providing context, made things easy to grasp. They could understand cooperative and competitive pretty readily. They already had an understanding of media and could apply it to games. And they knew what story conventions were like. It was simple. It was also a low-anxiety environment. The students were just talking about video games. It was something that they play and they do for fun, and then they were asked to make their own. So there wasn't really any nervousness. And finally, for meaningful engagement was again the final activity. The students really liked being able to craft their own video games. They were into it, they were enthusiastic, and writing pretty diligently, or brainstorming as hard as they could. As for what went well with the lesson, students grasped the vocabulary readily. They had some great ideas for their games, and fairly engaged throughout the lesson. Failings were mostly mine. I was late to my own lesson by about 10 minutes, which is frankly unforgivable. And I also feel that the students, while they were paying attention and pretty diligent about capturing that vocabulary, they were probably bored by it. Nobody likes to just watch somebody scratch words on a board. And some of the students had a little bit of difficulty coming up with an initial plot. They needed some help and some prodding to make things happen. So what could improve? I could be on time. That would probably help quite a bit, and I'd argue is the most important thing. If those students had twice the time to do the final activity, they could have had some really fleshed out plot lines and characters. I could also have incorporated the MPI worksheet as something to do instead of just copying down my words from a board, especially since the students knew the vocabulary pretty well already. I could have just gotten away with that. Would have made things more entertaining and more engaging. I also could have tried to find my own examples of video games and narrative parallels instead of relying on the students. That would have required greater communication between me and my host teacher, but I feel like it would have been worth it. Finally, I probably could have provided a little rubric or prompt for the final activity itself, which lays out just what I expected the students, have a section for characters, a section for plot, a section for setting, and just a basic explanation of the premise, rather than me simply telling them what they were doing and expecting them to grasp it immediately and readily. And to, I guess, include a drawing section. In any case, that was my lesson plan. I feel it was fairly successful, and I thank you all for watching this video.